RTX 20 series. In 2018, NVIDIA put hardware into a gaming card that movie studios had been renting CPU farms for days to do. They called it the RTX 20 series, and almost nobody wanted it. The cards went on sale on September 20th, 2018, and this was the first consumer GPU lineup in history with dedicated hardware for real-time ray tracing. Before this, ray tracing was strictly a film technology. If you wanted a ray-traced frame, you rendered it on a CPU farm for hours, sometimes days. The Turing architecture changed that by adding two new core types to a gaming card. The RT cores handled the ray math, and the Tensor cores handled AI workloads. This was also the generation where NVIDIA split its branding. Cards with the new hardware got the RTX name, while weaker ones on the same architecture, like the GTX 1660 Ti and 1650, kept the older GTX label. Then launch happened. The RTX 2080 Ti came in at $1,000 and the 2080 at $700, and by every technical measure, it was a big generation. But in traditional games with ray tracing turned off, the 2080 performed about the same as the GTX 1080 Ti, which had launched at the exact same price 2 years earlier. DLSS 1.0, the AI upscaler the Tensor cores were supposed to enable, was widely panned for producing images blurrier than native resolution, and ray tracing itself only worked in 3 games at launch: Battlefield 5, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and Metro Exodus. Jensen Huang later admitted to investors that RTX didn't sell as well as expected. NVIDIA had built the future about 2 years before the software showed up to meet it. RTX 30 series. 2 years later, the software had caught up. NVIDIA launched the RTX 30 series on September 17, 2020, with Jensen Huang presenting from his kitchen because it was the middle of the pandemic. The new Ampere architecture was, in NVIDIA's words, the biggest generational leap in GeForce history, and for once that wasn't just marketing. The RTX 3070 at $500 delivered RTX 2080 Ti performance for half the price, and the benchmarks actually backed it up. The flagship RTX 3090 replaced the old Titan line at $1,500 and was marketed as the world's first GPU built for 8K gaming, and then nobody could buy one. The launch day online store crashed under traffic. Cards sold out in seconds to bots. At the same time, Ethereum mining was booming, and GPUs were the tool of choice for generating it, which meant miners were treating these cards like money printers, paying 2 to 3 times MSRP without blinking all the way through 2021. NVIDIA tried to fight back by adding a hash rate limiter to the RTX 3060 that would cut mining performance in half if it detected the Ethereum algorithm. Miners found a workaround within weeks. The shortage lasted well into 2022, and by the time supply actually normalized, the 40 series was about to launch, leaving retailers stuck with walls of unsold 30 series inventory they couldn't move at a profit. That whole era left scars. In September 2022, EVGA, one of NVIDIA's longest-running and most respected board partners, announced it was leaving the GPU business entirely, citing years of disputes with NVIDIA over margins, marketing support, and how the company treated its partners during the boom. They never made a 40 series card. RTX 40 series. The RTX 40 series arrived in October 2022, built on the Ada Lovelace architecture and a custom TSMC 4nm process. The RTX 4090 at $1,600 was a genuine generational leap, roughly 50 to 70% faster than the 3090 Ti in regular rendering, with 76.3 billion transistors and a 96 MB L2 cache that was 16 times bigger than the 3090s. That part was uncontroversial. What happened next was not. NVIDIA announced 2 versions of the RTX 4080. One at $1,200 and one at $900 that used a completely different lower-tier chip with fewer CUDA cores, less cache, and less memory bandwidth. Calling both of them 4080 implied a performance parity they didn't have. The backlash was immediate. 3 weeks later, NVIDIA officially unlaunched the cheaper card, using that exact word in their own statement. It reappeared in January 2023 as the RTX 4070 Ti at the same $900 price. The 4090 had its own problem. The new 16-pin 12-volt high-power connector started melting on some cards, with investigations pointing mostly at the connector being easy to partially seat, which caused arcing and heat buildup under load. NVIDIA collected affected cards but never issued a full recall. DLSS 3 also debuted in this generation and introduced frame generation. It worked by having the GPU invent an entirely AI-generated intermediate frame and slot it between 2 real ones. The FPS counter roughly doubled. Input latency didn't get the memo, which kicked off years of arguments about what performance actually means. RTX 50 series. The RTX 50 series launched on January 30th, 2025, built on the Blackwell architecture. But technically, it's still using the same TSMC 4nm node as Ada, so it's not really a new silicon generation. The gains came mostly from the tensor cores and new AI features. The RTX 5080 held at $1,000, but the flagship 5090 jumped to $2,000, $400 above the 4090 at its launch, with 92 billion transistors, the largest count in any consumer GPU ever made. The centerpiece was DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation. Where DLSS 3 could insert one AI-generated frame between two real ones, DLSS 4 could insert 3. Combined with upscaling, NVIDIA marketed up to 8 times the performance of brute force rendering. At CES, Jensen Huang claimed the RTX 5070 at $550 delivered RTX 4090 performance. Reviewers tested it and found that was only true at maximum multi-frame generation on the lowest DLSS quality preset, where visual artifacts became obvious, especially when the base frame rate sat between 30 and 60 FPS. Several outlets also noticed NVIDIA was comparing MFG-enabled 50 series numbers against non-MFG 40 series numbers in its own benchmarks. The 12-volt high-power connector, now renamed 12-volt 2x6, had more melting reports on some 5090 configurations. NVIDIA also made life awkward for reviewers, sending no pre-launch samples of the RTX 5050 and delaying review access for the RTX 5060 so nobody could validate value claims before the cards were on sale. Tom's Hardware summed it up bluntly. Gamers, yeah, we're no longer NVIDIA's top priority. And that shift makes a lot more sense when you realize there's a whole other side of RTX most people have never seen. Quadro RTX. The card everyone thinks of as gaming technology actually launched a week before the consumer GeForce RTX 20 series to a completely different audience at 10 times the price. NVIDIA unveiled the Quadro RTX line at SIGGRAPH in Vancouver on August 13, 2018, and it's the card that introduced the Turing architecture to the world. Professional visualization artists got real-time ray tracing first. Gamers came second. The series included the Quadro RTX 8000, 6000, 5000, and 4000. The flagship RTX 8000 shipped with 48 GB of GDDR6 memory when the consumer RTX 2080 Ti had just 11 GB and it cost around $10,000. The RTX 6000 sat at $6,300. What you were paying for was ECC memory that could catch bit errors in engineering and scientific work, drivers certified against software from Autodesk, Dassault, and PTC, NVLink for pooling GPU memory across two cards, and larger cache configurations. Industry analyst John Petty, quoted in NVIDIA's own press release, said NVIDIA was delivering real-time ray tracing 5 years before anyone had thought possible. This was also the end of an era. The Quadro brand had been around since 1999, and the Quadro RTX was the last major generation to carry the name. RTX A series. The RTX A series launched on October 5, 2020, and finished killing the Quadro name. After about 20 years, professional cards simply became NVIDIA RTX A6000 or RTX A5000. The series also included the A5500, A4500, A4000, and A2000. The flagship A6000 used the exact same GA102 silicon as the consumer RTX 3090, just configured differently. The 3090 had 24 GB of fast GDDR6X memory. The A6000 had 48 GB of slower GDDR6 because 48 gig density chips weren't available in GDDR6X at the time. For GPU rendering and massive 3D scenes, capacity mattered more than bandwidth anyway. It also had ECC, certified drivers, and NVLink that let you pair two cards into 96 GB of pooled memory. Launch price was $4,650, roughly 4.5 times the flagship consumer card of the same generation. AMD's Radeon Pro line had nothing close at that memory tier, so NVIDIA basically owned the high end of visualization by default. RTX Ada generation. The RTX Ada generation was announced alongside the consumer RTX 40 series in September 2022. The flagship RTX 6000 Ada generation had 18,176 CUDA cores, nearly double the A6000, the same 48 GB of memory, and 960 GB per second of bandwidth, up from 768. In GPU rendering tests with V-Ray and Keyshot, it was around 2 times faster than the A6000. Then NVIDIA priced it at $6,800, up from the A6000's $4,650 2 years earlier. AEC magazine called the UK price of roughly £7,150 before VAT an incredible amount to pay for a single graphics card. And the Ada card also quietly dropped NVLink. Studios that had been running two A6000s for 96GB of pooled memory lost that option entirely. You now got one card with 48GB or nothing. For the workflows that relied on it, that was the kind of feature cut you only notice after you've already committed to the platform. RTX PRO Blackwell Generation. The RTX PRO Blackwell Generation was announced at GTC in San Jose on March 18, 2025, and the name itself is the biggest change. NVIDIA retired Ada Generation from the professional branding and replaced it with RTX PRO, the first time the professional line has had its own distinct sub-brand separate from the architecture name. The stated reason was to more clearly separate these cards from the consumer GeForce line. The series includes the RTX PRO 4000, 4500, 5000, and two versions of the 6000. The flagship RTX PRO 6000 Blackwell Workstation Edition ships with 96GB of GDDR7 memory, double the Ada predecessor, with roughly 1.8 terabytes per second of bandwidth and a 600-watt power budget. There's also a 300-watt Max-Q version that lets you fit up to 4 cards in one workstation without cooking each other. Third-party pricing puts the flagship above $8,300. But the real change isn't the silicon. It's what NVIDIA is actually selling these cards for now. The Quadro RTX was pitched at CAD, film VFX, and rendering. The RTX PRO Blackwell is pitched at agentic AI development, fine-tuning large AI models locally on a workstation, digital twin simulation, and robotics. The 96GB of memory is specifically sized to fit large AI models onto a single desk, a use case that didn't exist in any commercial sense when the Quadro RTX launched in 2018. In 7 years, NVIDIA went from selling a card to the artist rendering next year's animated movie to selling a card to the company training its in-house chatbot. The architecture names changed, the brand names changed, and the prices kept climbing. The cards are still called RTX. Almost nothing else about them is the same.